Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Forum, which organized tonight's event. This will be another one of our online programs where we discuss with an author his book and the ideas in the book. And I'd like to welcome the entire audience here, online audience. And those of you who are watching the live stream rather than later on, if you'd like to ask a question, just send it in through the chat box and we will ask Tamim Ansari about that. So tonight we have Tamim Ansari again. He was here back in April, and we've invited him back to talk about his book, The Invention of Yesterday, which is a great progression of 50,000 years of history to see how we ended up in the situation we're in right now. So let's get started, Tamim, and let's go back 50,000 years, or at least 45,000 years or so. We'll take about as many seconds as years in order to cover the first part before we get to history. But you have this, and a lot of people in history talk about the cave paintings and so on. How far away from us were their civilizations? How different?
I don't know how different they were. What I focus on is that once these cave paintings show up, you know that people are interacting in a way that we recognize as human now. Mm-hmm. And what I'm specifically referring to is the importance of language in shaping the experience we have as humans. And specifically, the role that language plays in enabling the networks of communication that result in culture. So I think once you see those cave paintings, and when they look at those, they also see little dolls that represent dancers, or they see dancers, paintings of dancers. Mm. You know that the whole panoply of human experience is there. Who knows how different it is? But if they've got language, for one thing, they're telling the stories of what their parents did, what their ancestors did. They've got history then. So I think, that's as much as we can tell about that.
Right. So you of course, focus on what almost everybody does about 5,000, 6,000 years ago or so, where people begin to seem to have a desire anyway to record, and not just orally maybe, but record their history or tell their legends, explain why they are who they are and what their culture is. And you talk about that period of time. And you talk about how four main cultures develop around four particular rivers, and those are the main cultures that you discuss. And then you have it, and then we'll get into the other cultures a little bit later. But it's very, very interesting, and that you said that the rivers and the characteristics of the rivers actually influence the culture. So let's spend a little time on those four cultures.
Well, first of all, let me just say, there may have been other rivers where cultures arose. There's some reason to think that there may have been an ancient culture that rose along the Amu River, which is the northern border of Afghanistan. But what I was interested in about those four river cultures that I'm talking about is that it's common to say rivers were the cradle of civilization, and it's because the annual flooding brought soil, and then they were able to irrigate, that soil every year. So that's true. But the question that occurred to me was, well, all of these rivers do that. And the civilizations, the cultures that arose on the banks of these different rivers, the Chinese civilization that emerged along the Huanghe River, the Yellow River, as it's translated, the Indus River, the Nile River, the Euphrates Tigris complex. If the same thing in all of these rivers were the explanation for how civilization arose there, why were those civilizations so different? Mm-hmm. And what you immediately notice is that, well, those rivers are not the same. They're all rivers, and they all do this thing of flooding annually and bringing the soil, but they're very different kinds of rivers. Now, the Nile River, the part we're talking about, that's the cradle of civilization there, it's about 400 to 600 miles below this area that's called the cataracts, which are thunderous falls and rocks and so on. You can't navigate a boat there or anything like that. And it cuts off the people upstream from the people downstream. And then below that, you have this placid, big, powerful river that's just flowing constantly south. And you have a breeze excuse me, flowing constantly north.
North, yeah.
When you live where I do, you automatically south is down, but that's one of those prejudices that we have. But
we'll just tilt the world around, and then you are right.
Yeah, there's no down or
take
up.
the African perspective.
The current is constantly flowing north, and the wind over that current is constantly flowing south, which means that people living along that river, they could put a boat in with a sail. If they put the sail up, they flow one direction. If they take the sail down, they're going in the other direction. That generates a certain kind of a commonality of culture up and down that river. Whereas, when you get to the Tigris Euphrates, it has rapids, it doesn't. It has rapids, it doesn't. There's swampy areas, and so there's human habitation arises in clumps along that river. So along the Nile River in Egypt, you get this monolithic civilization that's very similar from top to bottom, and it builds pyramids and so on. And in the Tigris Euphrates area, it's sort of like the product of that river is little empires that then start to conquer one another and build, bigger empires. So as I say in the book, it's like the Egyptians built pyramids, the Mesopotamians built empires.
I thought it was very interesting that you used the pyramid as a symbol for authoritarian culture, which they certainly had, because by itself, it's an image of authoritarian, one thing at the top and everything down below holding it up.
Well, yes, but the Mesopotamians built ziggurats. That was also
right.
Pyramid. What I was interested in there, the authoritarianism is certainly one thing that's going on with that metaphor. But the other thing that's going on is that, let's say in small hunting gathering tribal cultures, you can't have and you don't have a pyramid structure of decision making, because there's few enough people that at night you come around the campfire and you share what happened during the day. It's a networked situation. But when you get to something like the Nile is where we're going to stick, but it's the same with the Indus River. It's the same with that other the Chinese River. Decision making has to flow from someplace to lots, to thousands of people. If you're living along the Nile River, you're damming this huge river. You have a common enterprise that thousands of people have to be engaged in. And how does the decision making get to everybody? Well, there's only one way. One person tells 10 people, each of those 10 tell 10. That's bureaucracy, and bureaucracy is one of the features that emerges when civilizations begin to congeal.
Mm-hmm. What was the creation of bureaucracy in China similar? Because that's a very bureaucratic.
Was the creation of what?
Bureaucracy in China. Well, the Chinese have. I mean, by the time they get to Confucius, we're talking about a little bit earlier than that. By the time they get to Confucius, he's got this whole method of educating people for the bureaucracy, et cetera, which is still not completely the same, but fairly similar. And so, are there any compare and contrast between the bureaucracies in China and ancient Egypt?
Well, one of the distinctive features of that Huanghe River, which is in China, is that it is the least navigable of these rivers. It's a river that's just thunderous in certain parts. So habitation along that river was separated by the river rather than joined by the river. And in each of these places where human habitation emerged, the kind of the pattern that you saw was a circular pattern. It was a market center surrounded by clumps of villagers that are related in a family way, and they were living next to a river that its most defining feature is that it fills up with silt and it keeps the waters rise. So if you want to live by that river, you have to put up dikes to keep the water out. But every once in a while, if there's a big storm someplace upriver, the river floods and the dikes break. So you always have to be ready for catastrophe. So some of the roots of bureaucracy in a Chinese context, it goes back to that disastrous kind of thing, but it also goes back to you have to have a structure of decision making in place. You can't decide who's in charge when the flood happens, so
Yeah.
I think there's something there about the family and about the structured nature of the family early on in China. Later, when you get the development of bureaucracy in China, one of the defining features or one of the shaping features is that because all of these people that didn't have immediate face-to-face contact like that, they developed different dialects. They couldn't necessarily understand each other when they talked to each other. But early on, China developed a writing system. It wasn't a phonetic system, it was an ideographic system, but they could communicate up and down the river with this script system that developed. And as you go along in Chinese history, what you find is that the bureaucracy is closely related to the script, the writing. And you get a society in which very diverse numbers of people, different groups, they can have unity if there are scholars in those places that can read, so that the administration of a large area with many people is viable with the writing system. And people who can't talk to each other, if they sit down at a table, they wouldn't be able to communicate. But if they write a letter, then they understand each other perfectly.
Well, this is a little bit of a digression, but you, in a different part, you also talk about the importance of the Phoenician alphabet on the influence on all the languages that has affected. So we're talking about not a pictogram, but an ideogram in China. And we have in Egypt, it's a little bit more a pictogram. And then the Phoenicians come up with something new, which has a big impact on language. And we take languages a lot for granted, but as you said, the scholars and the bureaucrats are the ones who have to be the communicators. They're the middleman between all the different ways of looking and thinking of things. So.
Well, that's true, but the Phoenician system was a phonic system. It actually comes from that.
That's nice. Yeah.
And that was a whole different idea. The fundamental idea was language is made up of just a small number of sounds. And if you could get a symbol for each of these sounds, then no matter what you hear, you could write it down. And, the example that I give in the book is the Phoenicians were great traders. They went here and they went there, and they probably encountered people who were strangers to them constantly. But if they could hear those people, they could write down some version of what they said. So the next time they come back, they can say hello in the local language. And the thing about the ideographic system and the pictographic system of the Egyptians was that it involved thousands of signs. So it took a lot of study to learn how to read and write in Chinese, whereas this Phoenician system, this phonic system, it inherently had something about it that was more inclined towards a greater number of people learning to read and write, so that the scholars became, important expert officials in China in a way that they didn't, let's say, in Mesopotamia or Egypt.
Do you think that the difference in language and the way that we express ourselves had any influence on whether authoritarianism or individual democracy or any other kind of political systems? I mean, I know they didn't have democracies, but just more individuality in the system because it was easier to be a communicator and not be dependent upon an authoritarian system?
Well, I don't know if I'd go that way, because when I look at history, I find that no matter what language people speak, they find a way to have authoritarianism arise within the culture.
And that no matter how long they've had a democracy, it looks like they seem to look for authoritarians too. So let's cover the Indus culture. And we have the Indus River culture and how that was a little different.
Well, some of the features that I think are particular to that culture, the Indus River is actually not one river. It's actually 5 rivers now that flow through an area that's called Punjab, and Punjab means the 5 waters. Actually, that's what that word means. And it was a world. It was like water world. There was one thing about the Indus River, which is that water was not precious. There was plenty of that. And then another thing that was distinctive about the civilization that arose along the Indus River was that it was surrounded, or flanked at least, by these gigantic mountains, on the other side of which were the Asian steppes, the grasslands, which were favorable to the life of nomadic herders. And so these nomadic herders were on the other side of the mountains, and from time to time, constantly over the ages, they'd come down and they'd raid, or they'd try to set up in here. So in the Indus River early on, you got this incredible urban culture along the river, with these other kind of like, what they probably at that time would have called barbarians coming down.
Mm-hmm.
And the cities of the Indus, of the early Indus culture, were bigger than anything in any of these other cultures. It was vast. And the Harappan civilization, the Mohenjo-Daro, was 2 of the main cities there. I looked at this again and again because I couldn't believe my eyes. It said 1 million square kilometers. It's like, how could that be?
Mm-hmm.
I still am shaking my head at that, but whatever it was vast. And these cities were, they showed the evidence of careful city planning. And although we have not decoded any language that they used, they had something, because they made these little artifacts that had some kind of a script-like thing on it. So they did have language. And then at a certain point, when these big cities kind of fragmented, deteriorated for whatever reason, there's so many different reasons why a civilization loses energy and begins to founder.
Mm-hmm.
When this civilization began to founder, these other guys from the other side of the mountains, they flowed in more and more, and they began to set up between the decaying cities, and a whole different kind of culture developed there. And some of the defining features of Indian culture that we still think about, which is like the layered system of castes and occupational markers for people being separated into groups. And it's not groups, it's layered in some sense. So some of this comes from these newcomers that came in about 1500 BC or sometime in there. Mm-hmm. And how the old culture and the new culture is related, that's disputed, and I don't want to weigh in on that because there's a lot of different ideas. Mm-hmm. But then the Indo-European culture, and I'm going to use that term even though it's contentious, it doesn't mean Indians, it doesn't mean Europeans, it doesn't mean any of that. It's just a linguistic marker for a people that began to expand out of some area in the grasslands. Their language expanded with them, and it was very different. They tended to have nature gods, masculine sort of orientation, whereas the people of the original people of the Indus had agricultural gods and female deity. Mm-hmm. Important. So whatever it is, this mixture, now it flows down into India and it encounters something else coming up from the south. And where those cultures meet, you begin to see the beginning of what now we call Hinduism. Hinduism is its roots go back to Vedic culture, and Vedic are the people who came down from the north. But the original Vedic culture wasn't exactly what, even though the Vedas are now still the foundational important religious documents of Hinduism. Hinduism is not that. It's something new and something that emerged out of the mixture of these various cultures.
A little bit like Christianity emerged out of Judaism.
Well,
or is it different?
Maybe, it's like when those two sets of influences met, we don't know which was what. One thing we know, for example, is that the Vedic culture, they were cattle herders, and they ate cattle, and they killed horses and had big horse sacrifices. Once this mixture occurs, vegetarianism and ahimsa, the idea that there's something wrong with killing another life form, that emerged in there. That must have come from the further south. I don't know, what the roots were, but.
And just to put it in context for our audience, Mohenjo-Daro and the other cities from that time that you were first talking about, at what time were they really big? It's much earlier than 1500 BC, right?
Yeah, let's go back to at least 2000 BC for those. And the cities they built, those cities, they crumbled, and the bricks that their houses were made of were still around when the British came in like the 1800s. And the British found these bricks that were still very serviceable, and they used them to build, buildings along the railroads that they were producing. They didn't know, they had no idea at that point that these were bricks made like 4,000 years ago by a culture nobody even knew about. They didn't even realize this culture existed until I think the 1940s, 50s, something like that.
Do you know how they figured it out, that it was that old? I mean, was it radiocarbon dating or something like that?
I don't know the details.
You don't know that story? Okay, great. So another thing, I mean, I know your background is from Afghanistan. You talk about the Khoisan. We'll talk about the nomads in just a second, but you talk about the Khoisan culture, which is a mixture of Indian and Greek, because left over from Alexander. And you mentioned how it influenced the art, so that there's Buddhist art that looks Greek and so on and so forth.
Well, yeah, that style of art is known as Gandharan art.
Yeah.
Probably it has a different pronunciation in different places, but those Buddhas that were destroyed by the Taliban were examples of this Gandharan art. Right. And in India, where Buddhism arose, they weren't into making sculptures of the Buddha. They didn't think that enhanced spirituality. And the Greeks were all about making sculptures. Somehow for them, making a sculpture of your deities was a way of making them real. And then when these two influences mix, you have beautiful, sculptures, but they're all, this Gandharan art is influenced by the Greeks in the sense that they make, sophisticated physical forms, but always just of the Buddha. And if you look at that art, you can see that the purpose of the sculpture was trying to capture some sense of what Buddhism was all about. There's the peaceful lookingness of the
serenity, otherworldliness. It is gorgeous art. So now you tell the story of these big urban civilizations, and the percentage of human beings on the planet that were in those civilizations is relatively small. That most people were nomads, right? And or do we not know?
I don't think we know. At a certain point, everybody was hunting-gathering tribes,
right?
And then the pattern of civilization has been that. Well, let's put it this way: nomadism was the lifestyle for a much greater swath of the earth than these cities occupied. That's true, but the areas that the nomads inhabited were grasslands, and they were nomadic. Their area was vast. So I don't know how many people there were there. What I do what I do see is that the nomads, when a group was very successful and the group got big, what it did was split, because you can't move 1,000 people very
Mhm.
easily and conveniently. So when it got too big, it tended to split, and some of them went off. So that's why out of the grasslands, there was this dispersal that took whatever language had emerged in that area, and
Mhm.
it came drifting down, drifting east and west and then south into all these different areas, which is why, Greek, Italian, English, Farsi, Sanskrit, all these languages are come from the same ancestral root. And that's why they're
Mhm.
called Indo-European languages, because whatever it is, it's something that spread from some area and got as far as Europe in one direction and as far as India in the other direction.
We won't go into it here, but for those who are interested in a nice detective story, the 18th and 19th century linguists who put that together.
Yeah, I've lost you there, George.
We saw a connection between Sanskrit and Greek and Latin until
Uh-huh.
they started doing that. And it's fairly recent that puzzle's put together. And it's what also is interesting is that those language dispersal maps match the genetic dispersal maps that are now being made, right, of where the genes go. And so we have two different, in fact, we have other versions too, but the maps overlay each other in ways that make it fairly convincing, the story that we tell about what happened.
Absolutely. And there was arguments about, no, these languages, they all emerged, but no, the genetic, when the genetic data so perfectly matched the
Mhm.
linguistic data, that I would say that's that one has been settled.
That's one's been settled. So let's go to Africa for a little while. I mean, you touch on it from a little bit later period of time after Islam. But Africa, of course, has as many languages as all these other areas, and developed different empires and different things. But I think a lot of people are unfamiliar with that, the sweep of that part of the history. Do you have a sort of short, look at that and can give people an idea about how that continent was found? We do know that that's where everybody came from, basically, that we started there. But that was long, long, long ago. So in the last 5,000 years, what do we know about how the population distributed and developed and what cultures? Besides Egypt, we're familiar with that one.
Well, one thing we know is that there was a sophisticated culture that emerged more or less where Nigeria is now. Africa has that place where it, there's a fist and then it kind of bends down. Right
Right.
around in that bendy area, there was a culture that they call it the Nok culture, N-O-K.
Mhm.
And it wasn't as old as these other ones we've been talking about. And it also wasn't a river culture, even though there were the two big rivers of Africa were right there. It wasn't a river culture because those rivers do not carry sediment down from mountains, so they were not
Mhm.
favorable. They didn't particularly do anything for farming. But the Nok culture, uh, very little remains of it. But the reason is because they lived in a heavily vegetated area where the things they could build, the houses they built, were perfectly buildable from wood and from plant products. And elsewhere where people built from stone and clay because that's what they had, well, those
Mhm.
things lasted. And the Nok culture, they built, they made terracotta sculptures that they found those, although broken up in various places, they've put some of it together. But they can tell from the sculptures that it was a complicated society with layered culture and a lot of kind of status differentiation. So in that sense, it was sophisticated like Greece or these other places. At some point, for some reason that I think they don't really know, people began to migrate out of that area, and they migrated slowly. It wasn't really a migration; it was kind of a trickling across the landscape. Probably because they had the slash and burn technique of farming, which
Mhm.
meant you cut down the vegetation, you burn it, and then the ash fertilizes the soil, and it's
Mhm.
fertile for a while. But when it's no longer fertile, you got to move to the next place where there's
Something
brush
to burn.
down yet. And they might be there for a generation or two and then go to the next.
Mhm.
So that's why it's not really a migration. It's kind of like a seeping across the land. But it took 1,000 years probably for the people who spoke the ancestral language of many modern African languages to get over to the Atlantic side. And then once they got there, they moved south, and they probably met up someplace down in the where South Africa is now.
Mhm.
There is a couple of geographic factors that influenced, the evolution of society in Africa, which is that the tropical rainforest that's in the core of Africa,
Mhm.
and then below that, there's one of those really, ferocious deserts that it's really hard for, people to live in. Civilization was not going to emerge
Yeah.
there. And then north of that, you have the Sahara Desert, which completely divided Africa into a northern part and a southern part.
Mhm.
And today, a great many African languages are like these Indo-European languages. They're Bantu languages, and all of that seems to have come from this Benin, Nigeria area.
So they have a similar story to the Indo-European distribution of languages.
Yeah, and you know that some things like copper smelting and making copper and the iron, the stumbling upon the ability to make iron, that apparently emerged separately in the sub-Saharan Africa. It didn't come from the north. They discovered that on their own in some other way.
So basically, the Sahara Desert was what kept like Rome and any of the other civilizations from incorporating Africa, not the ocean so much.
Yeah. No, it was the Sahara.
Mm.
And the Sahara wasn't there maybe 7,000 years ago or
Oh, really?
Yeah. At one time that was a green, that was a lush area. And then for whatever reason, the desertification.
I hope it wasn't climate change caused by too much copper smelting.
I don't think it was that, but the Sahara Desert has been advancing, and part of the reason is that goat herding along the edges crops the soil so much. Goats way down that it allows the desert to keep invading the farmable land.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's go back to the nomads for a second. So we have these four big civilizations. We have an idea about Africa, but you basically say that the Asian steppes and Europe were filled with nomads, and that they were the cultures that kept around the fringes of these urban civilizations and would come and attack them every once in a while, steal a bunch of stuff and leave, and of course learn things in the process.
Well, they were between the civilizations, but also the homeland of nomadism, at least in the Eurasian part, was north. It wasn't, it's like there was a huge area from, let's say, around the Caspian Sea, or the gates of Europe there, all the way across to however it's pronounced, the Tian Shan Mountains or whatever. And so that area was the nomads area. And one of the points that I want to stress in the book, and that I'll raise now, is that nomads were not the left behind primitives. That nomads were people who developed a functional and sophisticated culture geared to their environment. Their environment was not, there was no rivers. It was, herding was exactly what worked up there. And they developed that to the nth degree. There were important and seminal inventions that came out of that nomadic area.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't know if you would call the domestication of the horse an invention. I kind of do.
Yeah.
That happened up there. And then the chariot was invented up there. And then, the composite bow, which, is a bow that you don't have to, you glue together a lot of strips of wood, and it makes a small bow that has a lot of tension.
Mhm.
And if you don't have the composite bow, if you want more oomph to the arrow that you're going to shoot, you got to get a bigger and thicker piece of wood. And there's a limit to how far you can go with that. Another thing that I believe was probably invented in the north up there were pants.
Pants.
Because you
They
can't
went with
ride-
horses, right?
Yeah, you need pants really help you ride a horse. So I think that was invented up there.
So I think we can assume that they had something like the Kentucky Derby, because they had a lot of contests. So we really can't take credit for doing that either, right?
Absolutely. You know what else they probably had that we still see in the Kentucky Derby? They probably had gambling, because the older people that came down into India were very much into things like gambling and drinking.
Yeah, I think gambling and drinking probably go back about a couple 100,000 years.
Yeah, and I'm sure it was everywhere.
Too fundamental to human life. But it's this group of nomads as you said, from the Caspian Sea all the way out to the edges of Mongolia and everything. It's from that group who 15,000 years ago went over the bridge to go to what's now North America and South America, right?
Well, who did that is difficult to say, because whatever that was, it happened maybe 30,000 years ago. It might have started, and it was whatever migration was happening. It was probably not, it almost surely were not nomadic herders. It was almost surely hunters and gatherers who did that. And there's some reason to think that the Siberian people, who are not, they're not the Turks, they're not the Mongols, they're a different people.
Yeah.
They might be related to the original migrants into the Americas, but nobody really knows.
And for the civilizations in the Americas, they developed obviously completely independently, or at least seemingly completely independently. There are people who argue that China, sailed there in 500 and all those kind of things. But in general, it's assumed that was totally independently, and yet they developed similar, had similar developments at not that big a difference in the time frame that they developed in terms of urban civilizations and agricultural developments and agricultural trade for their empires. So, well, it's interesting that where from all your research, where did you come down in this idea that it was totally independently created, or that there must have been some influence from another society for them to also make pyramids to also?
Well, that takes me back to another point, which goes back to the origins of language and, how language is related to culture. And I feel like, this is maybe one of my, the points that I'm most interested in the history that I'm telling, which is that when people have a network of intercommunication, the stories they tell circulate amongst themselves, and those stories hook up to become a meta-narrative, a big narrative, a kind of a framework for life. And it enables people to build a symbolic world together that exists in their mutual collective imagination. So by the time you get to people going into the Americas, that sort of a cultural universe with myths and stories and narratives, that I bet already exists, and some kind of ancestral mythological history already exists. So in that sense, they're not separate. Now, when they went over to the Americas, they were chasing game, and for a long time, they couldn't go much further than Alaska and just a little bit down into Canada, because there was a big ice sheet. It was still the Ice Age. It wasn't until the ice melted and cut them off from the rest of the world over there that they were able to migrate down into the Americas proper. What's interesting to me is that the kinds of cultures you see in the those river civilizations that you see in the East, in the Eastern Hemisphere, it feels like you don't see those in the Western Hemisphere. You know,
Hmm.
places where big, complicated civilizations emerged in the Americas were somehow high in the mountains or in the tropical areas. You know, in Peru, there was early cultures, and yes, they had settlements down by the sea, but they had settlements up into the Andes, and they were rain-based. And then in the tropical, like Central America or Mesoamerica,
Hmm.
those cultures, instead of focusing on how to guard the floodwaters that they were getting, instead, their big projects were building platforms out of the water, out of the swampy waters, to create the dry land on which they were going to farm and build their big civilizations. So
Hmm.
that part is fairly, there's something different going on.
Very
And
different. Yeah.
uh, as well, a crucial difference was that the Americas did not really have animals that could be domesticated and herded.
Hmm.
Once they had wiped out the big game, they pretty much think it was people that did that, the
Yep.
master and so on. Once they wiped those out, there were no cows, there were no sheep, there were no horses. Those
Hmm.
things didn't exist. There were buffalo, but for some reason, buffalo refused to be domesticated. So you could hunt them, but you couldn't herd them. There are llamas, but they live up in the mountains, and their legs are too skinny to pull carts and so on. So
Hmm.
they had a different function in those societies. So I think there were distinctive differences between the civilizations that arose in the Americas and those that in the Eastern Hemisphere. However, in the Americas, the sophistication certainly developed. The numerical system that was transformed by the idea of turning zero into a number, which happened in India, and
Hmm.
was also separately discovered by the Mayans in the
Hmm.
West. So, the calendars and all the different kinds of sophisticated things that happened in one place happened in the other. On the other hand, everything that had to do with the wheel didn't develop in the Americas. And it wasn't because they couldn't think of a wheel.
Hmm.
Some of their calendars are wheel-like.
Right.
But the thing is, the wheel, the potter's wheel was a function in the East, but more importantly was the cart. A wheel was so useful with a cart that's pulled by a horse. But if you don't have something to pull a cart, what's the point of a wheel?
What's the point of the wheel, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's move forward, because you talk about a lot of different ideas when we get to history period of time, and we'll get to questions in just a couple of minutes from the audience. So you can keep sending them. We have a couple, and you have this argument that I found fascinating, that there were three. This is sort of the Middle Ages. That there were three main Islamic civilizations. All of which had been doing very well. And then the plague came. And in Europe, which wasn't doing that well, the plague came. But each of those civilizations reacted differently to it, and that has created our modern world. So,
well, the plague, I could go on for a long time about plagues. I've been thinking about it because we're in the middle of
yeah,
a pandemic.
that's why I bring it up.
As pandemics have had an abrupt and drastic effect on altering the world historical flow. So one of those times was the Black Death. And, the Black Death emerged in the Central Asian area someplace, maybe where Afghanistan, Iran is, or someplace around there. But for whatever reason, it really did its damage in Europe. But in the other part of the world, there was a different kind of catastrophe that happened, which was the eruption of the Mongol armies, which sacked and destroyed whole cities. Now, there's a difference between war destroying things and disease destroying things. War destroys the infrastructure that was the proud fruits of a civilization.
Mm-hmm.
Plague killed all the people and left the roads and the castles intact.
Mm-hmm.
And who it killed most particularly were the peasants who were at the bottom of society, but they were the key to European society because it was entirely agricultural, and it was the peasants who did all that work.
Mhm.
And once there were so few peasants that, the lords with swords, I like to call them, once the lords with swords were hurting for peasants, those peasants became a precious resource, and they had bargaining power they'd never had before. All of a sudden, they could walk off the land, and what are you going to do about it, Lord?
Yeah.
Somebody else is going to pay you. They could set their own terms. That was one of the things that transformed and eliminated the feudal system in Europe, and that cleared the way for this commercial revolution that was about to start, which was intricately involved with the rise of Europe over the next 5 centuries, the commercial power.
Well, let's go to first question that has come in. Does your book address human-caused change to ecosystems and climates? I notice you just mentioned the thesis that goat herding accelerates the Sahara spread southward. So what have we learned from history, or what have we not learned from history that could be applicable today to the issue of climate change and how we're supposed to deal with it? We're both in the Bay Area here, and we had quite a day on last Wednesday. It was like a solar eclipse all day long because of the fire, and there was an orange haze all day long, and it certainly affected a lot of people's psychology because it was just so weird. So why don't you, if there's anything to enlighten us from history, that would be wonderful.
Well, the thing is, climate, not exactly climate change, but the changes that occur in the environment have been definitive for the development of cultures. I just mentioned to you that the Sahara once was green, and then it became the biggest desert in the world. So environmental shifts have always happened, and it has affected what's happened in history. But until recently, until let's say five centuries ago at the earliest, the attitude we had as humans to the environment, to the climate was, we're just little ants. We can't affect that. Nothing we do could change the environment. We're just adapting to it. And one of our assumptions was, what we have to do then is to make sure we leave behind as many kids as possible so that the environment doesn't wipe us out. Once we get to the machine age, we begin to develop this sense, bolstered by the fact that our machines become more and more powerful so that we can, in fact, change the climate. Our numbers increase to such an extent that we weren't able to keep up with the proliferation of our machinery, which we were burning fossil fuels, and we couldn't stop because there were so many of us, and we had to feed all of us, and now we're on the verge of choking on our own pollution and changing climate. I don't think, when I was born, I don't think anybody on Earth really thought that humans could do anything to affect the planet. The planet would affect people. And I would say that when I was a counterculture hippie guy in the 70s, that was a revelation that me and all my buddies were happening on, that, hey, you know something? We could be ruining the earth here. We better look out. And the environment became an issue for us then that I think it hadn't been until around then, until Silent Spring and some of these, the population bomb. That's when the consciousness emerged that we could have such a drastic effect. I won't go into what can we do about it, because that's too big an issue. But we do have to do. we got to do something. You've lost your. I don't know if you can hear me. I can't hear you. But I think one of the reasons that I'm writing this book, or have written this book, and what I'm concerned about, is that now, so distinctly for the first time, we are facing planetary problems that we have to confront as some single social organism that is all of humanity. And why I am so interested and focused on culture and language is that the nature of culture is, and the nature of language is, it creates self-enclosed complete networks. And so right now we're in a situation where we're facing planetary problems, but we are not any planetary creature. There's no planetary culture that we have, and we have to have some social narrative that enables us to feel like we are all part of something, or we'll never be able to confront this catastrophic something that is facing all of us. And I think history is a part of that. Let's tell the story of who we all are, not just who some of us are.
It seems to me that what I was trying to say when I wasn't being able to be heard was before the late 60s and early 70s, when a lot of people started writing about it, there was an attempt to like clean the water and clean the air. It wasn't planetary wide, but everyone noticed that the Great Lakes, for example, were getting polluted. And at other times, we've noticed that things have gotten polluted, and they did something about it, and it changed. And so there's always been that adapt, as you said, we adapt to the earth. The earth is getting ruined, or we're ruining it in this one area. Now let's fix it. So that's, I think, was the prelude. But I think you're right. At the end of the 60s and the early 70s, a lot of books were written that made it very clear that we have to do something about this. You have a great idea about, well, you have this idea about peripheral cultures because you say that every culture looks at every other culture as peripheral. and your point is that we have to stop doing that if we're going to get someplace as a human race on this planet and do something about the big issues. Do you have any particular prescriptions? I mean, it seems to me it's, pretty simple just to say, hey, no one culture can dictate to any other culture. And if you look at history, even those that came in and conquered another culture, they often were conquered by the culture of the place that they conquered more often than imposed a culture on them. So,
well, it happens all different ways. Cultures weave together and new cultures emerge, which is one of the reasons why I think we have to be careful not to conflate the cultural imperialism that is the product of actual political imperialism and economic imperialism with cultural mingling, with cultural, with cultures interacting to produce new cultural products or new cultures. The danger of looking at, say, something like cultural appropriation too primitively is that you're blocking the ability for cultures to begin to unite and combine to form new and bigger cultures. And we have to do that. Now, the thing that I'm saying specifically about history and peripheral cultures is that, all cultures, all world histories are a somebody-centric story of how we got to where we are today. And what I'm saying is that the world story we need to tell now is still going to be how did we get to where we are today, except the we is going to have to be all of us. And so the story we're going to tell has to take account of the fact that we came from very many places. And the story we tell is going to be about the interweaving of those cultures, how they interacted, how they affected each other, what they discovered because they were in conversation with each other, so that we can have a story that is the story of all of us and that makes us feel like a sense of peoplehood about us all being here together now on this little planet.
Yeah, you have a great concept of the cultural narrative. And you mentioned some cultural narratives seem to be more tenacious than other ones, that some cultures just keep holding on. They're doing something for what humanity wants. You mentioned the Jewish culture is a small, relatively small group, but it's tenacious. Their narrative just keeps holding on for that group. What's interesting is, as you said, we're coming at it with all these different narratives. And of course, we've all beaten each other up quite a bit. I always think, if we move forward, if we just said every piece of land on the planet has probably been stolen at least 1,000 times, in the last, 100,000 years, and quite often in the last 5,000 years.
Yeah.
And we just have to think more about moving forward rather than righting all the wrongs, because there's no way to right all the wrongs. And it's our ancestors that suffered more than we do. There's always aftermaths of all these cultural problems, of course, that continue on and on. But it seems that we can get rid of them faster if we move forward rather than try to recreate the past or.
Well, we can't fix the wrongs of the past, and we can't do it by forgetting what happened in the past.
Right.
We can and must fix the wrongs as they exist now and going forward. But for me, I was born and raised in Afghanistan. I'm here now. My mother was American. My father was Afghan. And all my life, I've confronted a pressure from various sides to say, which are you? You have to be one or the other. Are you an American or are you an Afghan? And I resist that. And I kind of, frankly, it ruffles me. It's like, no, I'm both. And I'm not rejecting my mother or my father. Sorry, I'm something. If that's something new, then that's something new. And I want a world in which there's more people like me, a mixture of everything.
Yeah, we can look forward to all being Polynesian, right? That would certainly be a great outcome if that's what happened from a looks point of view. So yeah, there's you touched on it, cultural appropriation, which is of course a big issue. But I always look at it as cultural appropriation or cultural appreciation. And what we really want, I think it would be a great conference, a world conference, if every culture came and said, these are our culture's contributions that we think the whole world culture should appreciate, for the next 1,000 years. And these are our top 10 nominees for that. Sort of like the way UNESCO does all the World Heritage Sites or something like that. So that people have a list of pride that their culture created. And every culture has a list like that. And then we could incorporate that into world history lessons everywhere, that kind of thing, instead of always having a point of view from the culture you're talking about world history, which is always like the maps. The maps of the world, if it's a United States map, the United States is in the center, and of course it makes the United States look bigger. And if you take Russia and the Russian maps there in the center, that makes Siberia look enormous. It is big enough all by itself, but that kind of cultural chauvinism doesn't stop anywhere, So
no, but I will say this. I don't know if we're running out of time, but I will say that.
No.
Okay, I will say this. Since being locked up in this pandemic, doing a lot more. I've been like rummaging around in my past, and among the things I've been doing is I've been discovering that on YouTube, I can hear music that I heard when I was a kid that's Afghan music. Mm-hmm. And what I find is that, my American friends, they like some of it and it's exotic and so on. For me, it's not that. For me, it's like Elvis Presley,
right.
How the Beatles affect me. The same is true of how, when I listen to Noshe Nos, an Afghan, he's still alive, I think. He's like 80, 90 years old now. But when I listen to him, and he has a way of trilling his voice that's like, that. I want other people to be able to appreciate that.
Right.
And when I read the poet Hafiz, there's no translating it. I like to try to translate it, but I'd also like to try to bring some way of being able to convey to others so that they can experience it, what it's like to hear some of those lines.
The Russians all feel that. The Russians all feel that way about Pushkin.
I'm sure.
There's just no translating to another language without losing so much of the fluidity and the beauty. And of course, languages rhyme in different ways. Italian is easy to rhyme, that kind of thing. It makes a big in poetry as your language and everything. No one imagined that, but it is a great thing about the YouTubes and everything else. And I think if we can make a distinction between this appropriation and appreciation, I think you're absolutely right that we need to be able to appreciate all the other cultures and what they've accomplished in order to move forward. Because, even if you don't accept each of the things that they think are wonderful, you at least say that culture has also accomplished something, and therefore they can join us in accomplishing something more. It's like everybody has competence, instead of thinking that elsewhere everybody's incompetent. Those kind of statements that just prejudice an entire place and say, nobody there has ever done anything of any use whatsoever. But if you take something like the invention of movies, for example, okay, so that's a technological invention, but everybody has used it differently. And it's true, Americans don't see a lot of the good movies from other countries. But this shutdown has made people bored enough that they maybe have even tested that and gone out and see, I have seen everything already here 3 times, so now I'm going to go and try something else. And you find that there's all kinds of things from other countries, and yet it's the same technology, but it's a very different culture as to how it's put on. So let's see, one last question. You're working on another book right now. So what are you working on right now? Because it's somewhat related. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, a huge theme in the book we're talking about now is narrative. And I don't think I've been able to really communicate what I mean by narrative. So my next book is really going to be tracing and studying the history of a narrative. Mm-hmm. And that narrative is conspiracy theory.
Oh my.
I know.
You're going to get a lot of attention for that one.
It's a scary book to write. But so what I'm doing is not just tracing the history, but like examining what is a narrative? How does this thing work? I'm going to compare conspiracy theory to a virus in culture. It gets into the culture. It can infect other cultural forms that are not conspiracy theory, that have total validity, but are then diseased because they've got conspiracy theory inside them. Yeah. And I'm going to show that we're in a crisis state with that too right now.
we are. It reminds me of one of my favorite anonymous quotes, which is, an idea is not responsible for the people who believe in it. And here, you as you said, there's people who believe certain things, and they attach themselves to other groups altogether that are trying to accomplish a lot of reform groups that try to accomplish something, reform in society, get those kind of groups attached to them, and it ruins their reform.
Yeah. My point about conspiracy theory, part of what I want to try to get across is that it exists in culture, as many other things do, but conspiracy theory really will bring it out. Conspiracy theory exists in culture like an organism. It has a life and a will of its own, and it goes out and searches for cultural events and phenomena that it can get inside of. Mm-hmm. And it's not any person that's doing that. It's the narrative itself is like a live organism within the landscape of culture.
It's a very good analogy. And there's no way to kill that virus either.
Well, I think there's ways to weaken it though. That's also what my book is about.
The vaccine against conspiracy theory is going to come in your book. How's that? That'll be the vaccine again.
We need that too.
We can bring it down enough that way. That'd be just wonderful. Well, that was a wonderful conversation again, Tamim. Thank you very much. The author of The Invention of History, Destiny Disrupted, in other books, and working on the conspiracy theory. We won't ask anybody to attach themselves to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me here. This has been a lot of fun, George.
Yeah, my pleasure again. So ends another event at the Commonwealth Club. In its 118th year of enlightened discussion, this 118th year has been very different. Thank you very much for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. Bye-bye.